The nature of truth in theology and science. John 18:38 is the verse that relates to us the famous question by Pilate to Jesus, "What is truth?" It is a question that has given rise to countless sermons approaching the issue from many different directions. To me, the most obvious way to preach on this text, perhaps because I've done precisely this, is to stress that this question has already been answered earlier in the Gospel of John. In chapter 14, verse 6, Jesus declares that He is the truth, as well as the way and the life. For Christians, it does not make sense to ask the question, what is truth? Because, we argue, truth isn't really a what, it's a who. A person who actually comes to meet with us. What is interesting is that we can declare strongly within the context of a sermon that the way the world sees truth is not accurate to how things really are, and yet we can miss the incredible implications of that observation outside of directly or distinctly Christian thinking. You see, the question, what is truth, has become a very fashionable one. In many ways, we could say that Pilate was the original postmodern thinker. While the nation of Israel was shouting, in effect, that Jesus was not telling the truth and should be gotten rid of, Pilate was closer and yet so very far away from understanding the situation. Whereas his own countrymen considered Jesus to be someone hostile to the truth, Pilate didn't seem to care. The notion of truth was not something he troubled himself about. Like a good Roman, he was concerned about law and order, about good functioning, and that was hard enough without being bothered to worry about whether there was some notion of truth that they should try to live according to. While the Jewish people rejected Christ because he didn't fit their understanding of truth, Pilate rejected the notion that there was a truth to fit in with. You may or may not be aware that the question of truth is something of a hot topic at this time within philosophy. Whereas we used to speak of things in terms of truth and falsity, the language has now shifted largely so that truth means nothing more than valid. That is to say, we don't say that a religion or philosophy is true because it tells us what is the case objectively. Rather, a set of convictions is true inasmuch as they all hang together in a coherent way, where there are no internal contradictions among the statements being made. There may not be anyone who has had as much of a profound impact on the way we think of truth as Aristotle. In his Metaphysics, he defines truth and falsity so that he can be clear as he moves on with his points. He writes, "We begin by defining truth and falsehood. Falsehood consists in saying of that which is that it is not, or of that which is not that it is. Truth consists in saying of that which is that it is, or of that which is not that it is not. Therefore, he who says of anything that it is, or that it is not, says what is either true or false." There are many fascinating issues in this definition. For example, what does it mean to define falsehood first? Is Aristotle meaning to imply that we cannot understand truth except against the background of falsehood? We might also ask whether truth is really the opposite of falsehood, or whether there's a better set of opposites. What I want to point out is that Aristotle does something that has shaped discussion ever since, and has done so in a way that he has been almost entirely unchallenged for over 2,000 years. Aristotle defines truth in terms of our statements. Truth, says the great Greek philosopher, consists in saying things. We might say that Aristotle already had sown the seeds of modern relativism because even though there's a sense in which objective reality plays a role in his notion of truth, when we get right down to it, truth is about saying things. In the end, truth is something that can be expressed, can be written down, can be captured in words. This has had incredible implications ever since. And rather than pointing them all out, I want to take a different angle and explore how the Christian conviction from earlier can help us to have a different point of view and attitude regarding the nature of truth. Jesus tells his disciples that he is the truth, truth in his very person and being. We've already noted that this means that it is not possible for a Christian to consider truth as nothing more than a what, but as much more. In light of the definition of truth by Aristotle, and which has been followed by so many, it should be clear that it is not possible for a Christian to think of truth primarily as having to do with the stuff that we say. Truth in its fullest sense is the living person of Christ, God in flesh. And what this means is that whatever we mean by statements being true, and this includes theological and even biblical statements, we cannot mean the same thing as we mean when we say that Jesus is truth. So the question we're left with is, if truth is not to be defined in terms of our statements, but needs to be rooted and grounded in the reality of Christ, in what way can we speak of truth outside of the truth of God? And what exactly do we mean when we say that statements are true? When we define truth in terms of who God is, especially as revealed in Christ, we realize that truth doesn't come with reasons. You can't say why Christ is truth other than the fact that he is. In fact, if we were to try to give reasons why Christ is the truth, we would already be admitting that we don't believe it. Truth is what it is and does not rely on anything outside of itself to make it what it is. Recall the words that God spoke to Moses at the burning bush in response to the question to Noah's name. I am who I am, carrying with it also the meaning I will be who I will be. God being who he is and the faithfulness that he exhibits, even when becoming something other than he has been in Christ, forms the basis of this Christian notion of truth. By extending this notion of truth to created beings, we arrive at a notion that truth is properly understood as lodged not in our statements about beings, but in beings themselves, inasmuch as they are what they are and not some other thing. In this case, we can say that our statements are true, or more precisely, that they are truthful, when they faithfully serve that to which they direct us. This way of thinking is not entirely without precedent. Alfred Tarski developed a notion of truth that is not altogether unlike what I have been spelling out, though it of course has no reference to God or the Christian gospel. The difference is that while Tarski's theory of truth realizes that we need at least two levels if we want our understanding of truth to make sense, the level of our statements and the level of reality beyond them, he still speaks of truth as something that is primarily or exclusively something that statements have. For Tarski, truth is still something we want to capture in our words and be able to manipulate according to strict logical processes. In light of the Christian gospel, what has passed over the years as discussions on the nature of truth are, in point of fact, discussions on the nature of truthfulness. Indeed, we see that Aristotle's definition almost suggests this, though it seems he did not notice it. He defines truth as the opposite of falsehood. The more natural way to speak would be to say that truth is the opposite of falsity. The opposite of falsehood is truthfulness. Had Aristotle taken this into account, the whole history of reflection on this topic might have been radically different. However, the moment we speak of statements as being truthful rather than as being true, it means that we have to take what could be called the truth of being into account. A battle has been raging since the latter half of the 20th century between different understandings of the role of theory in science. On one side, you have those who argue for a form of what they call scientific realism, and those who oppose them who are known as scientific anti-realists. Neither side denies the practical advances that have been made by science, but they disagree about how we should interpret theories. In one way or another, realists say that if a theory says that something exists, we should believe that it really does exist. There are many reasons for this. It's intuitively simpler. It seems to be how scientists have historically interpreted theories. It's hard to make sense of the amazing success of science if we assume that the things we talk about in our theories are simply not there, as well as others. Anti-realists, by contrast, point to the history of science and highlight that scientists such as Newton did not always follow their own advice when it came to scientific practice. Does it make sense to insist that we affirm the existence of things that we have not been able to observe with our senses? In the early days of modern atomic thought, Ernst Mach famously said to Max Planck regarding atoms, "Show me one." Others have thought that if we affirm the existence of things we have not observed, where is the distinction between science and metaphysics, or even, horror of horrors, theology? Even if some of the more extreme examples of scientific anti-realism go a bit far, there is no question that they make some very good points that are often not dealt with adequately by those who would defend scientific realism. Arguments based on notions such as approximate truth and inference to the best solution are notoriously vague, and in some cases hopelessly naive. If it is true that the main arguments for scientific anti-realism destroy any hope of a genuine realism in science, then it's hard to not be convinced that this is indeed the case. However, one of the things that is not immediately clear is the fact that the question, what is the real that we are talking about, is not all that different in practice than the question we have been considering, what is truth? We noticed before that the overwhelming majority have approached truth in terms of our statements rather than with the beings to which our statements direct us. We found that the Christian position on truth demanded that, after the truth of God and Christ, the next most appropriate way to think of truth is in beings. In the mainstream of the debate over scientific realism, the discussion assumes that what is real is our theories. The question is always, to what degree are our theoretical expressions true? If that is the question, and if we take truth in the Aristotelian sense, then we have no choice but to say that the central anti-realist arguments are condemning to scientific realism. But what if we approach the whole issue from the conviction that truth is something that is in reality first and only secondarily in our statements? Then we find that as we can never capture the richness and dynamic nature of reality in our statements, so we will find that our statements are occasionally wrong according to the Aristotelian definition, but are rooted in the truth of being. In fact, so far is the need to change our statements or theories from being a sign that they are utterly false, it is precisely because the statements or theories were so good at directing us toward the reality that transcends them that we came to realize they needed to be replaced in the first place. If the real in realism isn't our words or statements but the reality that we intend beyond them, then the classical anti-realist arguments do not, in fact, destroy realism. In fact, they are demanded by it, and demanded in a way that makes more sense of the entire scientific endeavor than anti-realists often grasp. It is out of fashion for scientists and philosophers to take advice from theologians about how they might proceed. It would be inappropriate to suggest that thinkers working in decidedly secular fields should take distinctly Christian claims into their explicit position. However, the implications of Christian faith for an understanding of truth provides a different way of looking at the problems that have arisen over the years. There's nothing inherently religious about seeking truth as having more to do with being than statements. Though we may have taken our initial hint about another way of looking at things from religious convictions, the thought that we might turn the classical discussion of truth on its head is a legitimate approach. Perhaps as Christians come to realize the importance of their own tradition and work out its own implications for non-religious thought, the climate of discussion might begin to change.